Thank you. And I want to welcome, I was so excited when I went through the list of people who signed up for this virtual discussion. And I'm so honored by so many alum, faculty, staff, community members, and particularly community members from the Asian American community. This is a timely discussion for us to have. And I wanted to kind of frame why this is important for us to talk about it. At the beginning of April, actually probably the week before that, a couple of weeks after we all went to online teaching and remote working at UConn, what was happening in the country was that the increase of xenophobia and anti-Asian racism was being felt all over the country. And we started to see reports of all of these issues coming up in communities, and many webinars that were being held to talk about what was happening, particularly in the Asian and Asian American community. And I was very concerned about what that meant for our students at UConn, and particularly our Asian international students. And in a conversation with my colleagues, first with all of the Cultural Center directors, we realized that we were very concerned for all of our students. Students who couldn't go home because they didn't have a safe home to go to, the students from the GLBTQ community who also felt unsafe, other students in the other communities of color, our undocumented and documented students. So we all decided that it would be really important for us to come up with a letter, and a letter that went out to the UConn community around April 2nd. And with that, we asked our corresponding ethnic and gender studies institutes to also sign on to our letter, and they were more than willing to do that, along with the Dodd Center, the Human Rights Institute, the Center for Judaic Studies, the International Student and Scholar Services, and the Office for Diversity and Inclusion. And all of those people, we are partners beyond what we did in this letter. We are very concerned about social justice issues, issues about discrimination, racism, sexism, homophobia. And we sent this letter out. This letter is available. You can see it on any of our websites, but I'd like to read a small portion of the letter and how we framed it. And so, again, the full version you can see on any one of our websites. So I quote, "Students have shared with us how vulnerable and targeted they are feeling. We are aware that many of our students are facing unemployment, limited access to health care, and other hardships. We also understand that his experiences, coupled with isolation, may manifest in mental health related concerns as well. We would like all of you to know that you do not need to navigate these difficult times alone, and that we will stand and work with you to get through this together. If you find yourself disconnected or not supported in your current living arrangements, please reach out to us. You are all citizens of UConn Nation, and in this nation, we do not discriminate. We do not use a narrative of hate. We are citizens that stand in solidarity with one another. Now is the time for us to be safe, be compassionate, and empathetic towards one another, particularly those who have been affected by the COVID-19 virus, and to be engaged citizens. We would like to remind you that each and every individual, that they are valued and needed in this world." And so with that, I hope that we can get to a point tonight where we can talk about how we can all be engaged and how we can all be supportive of one another. I was humbled by an email that I got soon after we went remotely by Mike Keogh, who is the founder of I Am Not a Virus campaign. I have known Mike for years, probably close to 20 years now. When he was a college student, he is an award-winning photographer, and he was the one that conceived of this campaign. You'll get to see a little bit about the campaign, and you'll also hear from Kelly Ha, who is the campaign manager for I Am Not a Virus. And this is it's powerful particularly for the Asian and Asian American community, because too often our voices and our stories are not being told, not being listened to, and not being given any kind of platform. And so the platform that has been dealt to us right now is that from the rhetoric in the country is that now Asians are now to be blamed for this particular virus. And so with that, I'd like to introduce both Mike and Kelly, who will discuss, and I think we'll also be showing a video about the I Am Not a Virus campaign.
Hi, I'm Mike Keogh. I'm the founder of I Am Not a Virus, the campaign. It began as a personal photo project in my studio. My son is 4 years old, and I was hearing all these stories, and my sister-in-law, who lives in Rhode Island, was called COVID or Corona in late February, and it really affected her. And she texted the family group chat, and she was just happy that her daughter wasn't there to witness it. Her daughter is half Asian, half white. And, this sparked a conversation that my wife and I had with our son about how he belonged and that he was American. And we didn't want him to feel that he was singled out or, there were people out there. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to go into the studio and take portraits of Asian Americans and the Asian diaspora. It started off with family and friends, and I want them to be a part of it to have, I didn't want them to have masks on their face. I didn't want them to be covered. I wanted them to be happy and proud of who they were and to give them a way to express themselves. And oftentimes when we're in moments of crisis, we don't really know how to express how we're feeling. So we came up with an I am statement. And it's, I am, what about you makes you happy about yourself? For me, I'm a father, I'm a gardener, I'm a wedding photographer, and I'm an MMA fan. And these things kind of define who I am and, what makes me happy and who I see as my community. So we've had volunteers come in, and they were happy to come in. Some of them, didn't really identify with their Asian American heritage. So this was a new experience for them. And we wanted to give voices to our community that are often shadowed or marginalized, like the GBLTQA community, the adoptee community, Southeast Asian Americans that aren't represented often, and just to show how diverse the Asian American community really is, and that attack against us was an attack against your neighbor, that we were as American as anyone else. The response has been overwhelming. I met Kelly, who's our campaign manager, at that. She was actually the last person to come into the studio before Governor Lamont did the shelter in place. Kelly's been amazing. She's been really helping with the mental health aspect, the allyship aspect, which is really important, especially with what's been happening recently, or not happening recently, but now that social distancing is being relaxed, we're seeing a lot more racism. And so allyship is really important for us in building this sense of community. And the response has been overwhelming. I think people really resonate that an attack against an Asian American is an attack against their neighbor, because we are deeply ingrained into the community as business owners, as shopkeepers, as waitresses, doctors, and the whole gambit of what it means to be a part of your community. We've been able to create connections with groups like the Connecticut's Commission of Women's, Children, Seniors, Equity, and Opportunity, Reimagination Migration, which is a nonprofit that works with immigrant education. We've been able to meet groups like the Immigrant Initiative Project, who have created an Asian American curriculum already, and they piloted it in New Haven. But it's been fantastic, and thank you for having us here today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Ha, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a second-year Master's of Social Work student in the Individual Groups and Families concentration and also a student in the Certificate in Foundations of Public Health program. I joined this campaign after connecting with Mike in his photography studio for my portrait mid-March. When Mike and I started talking, I think he realized that we had very similar visions and brought me on as outreach coordinator and promptly promoted me to campaign manager. At first, I thought Mike was insane for giving me such a big role. And even now, sometimes I question it too. But I am incredibly thankful for the support and belief that he has in me as campaign manager. So as campaign manager, I oversee the team, projects, social media accounts, as well as lead the mental health initiative. What I love about social work is that it is incredibly versatile, and although I am more clinically focused, I love that I can explore more of the macro aspect with this campaign. I love that I do not need to choose between macro and micro work, but the fact that I can do both is amazing. I am also incredibly fortunate for the supportive community that I have at the UConn School of Social Work that helped our campaign get to the place that it is now. With the events of COVID-19, racism and violence against the Asian community has risen. Many fear leaving their homes, many are experiencing ethnic self-hate, some are blaming themselves, which is why an emphasis on mental health is so important during this time. My family has not only faced the financial hardship of not being able to work during this pandemic, but also they continuously fear the outcome of leaving the house. They worry they'll be verbally harassed or physically attacked. It hurts me knowing that they no longer feel safe in the place they escaped for safety. I am a very family-oriented person, so my family is my motivator and my inspiration for my passions, which is why I'm hoping to create a world where they can feel safe once again. My goals for the mental health initiative is to destigmatize mental health and receiving mental health services, highlight Asian mental health professionals, and offer accessible resources to the community. With my work, I have implemented several projects and created resources for our community. Currently, we are in the middle of Mental Health Week, which is a project in celebration of AAPI Month and Mental Health Awareness Month. We have addressed topics such as Asian masculinity, Asian male stereotypes, Asian representation education, the Asian LGBTQ experience, and we are on track to dedicate a week in July to discuss topics of parenting in celebration of Minority Mental Health Month. Being a child of Vietnamese refugees myself, I know firsthand the difficulties first-generation Asian immigrants have about sharing their hardships, trauma, and immigration stories. Intergenerational trauma is such a prevalent topic, and addressing it is so important in order to help people start the healing process, so it is not passed on to the next generation. Although our campaign is a response to xenophobia that has been occurring, we have the fullest intentions to continue this campaign even when this pandemic is over. With topics such as mental health, Asian representation in education, and reform and diversity trainings, we want to make a lasting impact and create change that will further community. Thank you.
I pump air into their lungs so they can.
I'm not a virus.
I sponge bodies of my patients when their fever is raging.
I turn them over so their bodies won't get sores.
I am not a virus.
I pump air into their lungs so they can breathe. I comfort them when they are afraid.
I am not a virus.
I pray for them.
And rejoice when they show signs of recovery.
There are thousands of people like me,
Working in countries
Far away from our homelands.
far away from our families.
We are at war, not against any nation or race or creed, but against a common enemy.
A virus that has killed
Hundreds of thousands of lives.
in so short a time
In this battlefield, we are your weapons.
against a menacing superpower.
That doesn't discriminate. Humans should learn from the virus.
We are more powerful when we don't discriminate.
Thank you, Mike and Kelly. When I first saw your campaign, I was struck by the power that it holds. And I want to thank you for putting that together. And hopefully you'll get we'll have a lot of conversation around it tonight, as well as people who want to connect with you to talk to you about how they can get involved. You know, Kelly's story is all too familiar to those of us who work in the community. And that's why it's important for us to be sitting here, hopefully, with not only our community members, but our allies in figuring out how do we solve this? How do we get to a point where nobody is being blamed because of having a face that looks like it's the enemy? And so we also have some panelists here, Dr. Kathy Schwinn-Biles and Dr. Jason Chang, who have been doing incredible research in Asian American studies against anti-Asian racism, and also about history and what we need to be doing in the classroom and in the community. I'd like to start out first in introducing Dr. Kathy Schwinn-Biles, who is the former director of Asian and Asian American Studies at UConn, and now serves as Associate Dean in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. I've had the pleasure of working with Kathy for a very long time. We've been partners with the Cultural Center and the Studies Institute, and her leadership has really advanced Asian American studies at the University of Connecticut and has really put us on the map nationally as well as globally. And so with that, Kathy, I'll turn it over to you to talk about, to discuss more about the history of anti-Asian racism and the juxtaposition of anti-Asian racist cartoons.
Great. Hi, can everybody hear me? Yes? I'm going to switch to everybody can hear me. So to add a bit of levity, I'm so sorry. I realize like many of us, I am cutting my own hair. And I have just realized how bad that choice was now. So on me, not about the panelists. So I want to thank Angela for a truly generous, I would say overly generous characterization and introduction. And I actually wanted to shift things a bit. Initially, when we came together as a group, I thought it might be worthwhile to, kind of show how longstanding anti-Asian, anti-Asian American racism has been through political cartoons. But actually, after spending some time with the work that Mike and Kelly have done, and also thinking more seriously about the work that Angela and my colleague Jason has done, I thought it might be worthwhile to actually highlight why allyship matters in this, right? So I think that, I'll go back and forth a bit. I want to kind of keep my comments more conversational. But what's really quite striking is that even though there has been a lot in terms of media accounts of the rise of anti-Asian racism and anti-Asian American racism in the United States, this is something that is not new. So, for example, our very notion of illegality with regard to immigration is actually something that comes from Chinese immigration, and the only immigration act to target a specific group was the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and that was reiterated to encompass other Asian immigrant groups. So this is something that's not new. I think that after 9/11, for example, the number of hate crimes against Asian Americans went up 400%. And that percentage is admittedly a low estimate, given that many Asian and Asian Americans do not feel comfortable actually reporting crimes to the police for a variety of reasons. So they range from the idea that you don't want to make waves, you want to kind of assimilate into US society. If you are from a refugee background, which is my background, maybe you're used to being distrustful of the government because the government was oppressive. So there are a number of reasons why even the number of incidents reported now, I would stress as an underreportage. But with that said, San Francisco State, since the COVID pandemic hit the United States, has reported 1,700 incidents of anti-Asian American violence and discrimination in 45 states. So this is not something that is limited to the East Coast. It's not something that's limited to the Deep South. In fact, it's pretty ubiquitous. And I would dare say that what unites us as Americans, to go to Mike's point, is the fact that we all, we probably live in a place or have family in a place that these incidents are reported. 2,000 incidents have been reported, according to the Ipsos and the Center for Public Integrity. Oh, okay. And one thing that I will say is that 32% of Americans, and that's not just Asian Americans or those of Asian descent, but Americans have witnessed someone blaming people of Asian descent for the virus. So that's 32% of Americans, right? So I bring these statistics up. They can be quite overwhelming, and I think that the power of Kelly's work and Mike's work is that you actually individualize what this looks like by way of a portrait, because it's one thing to think about percentages and numbers. It's another thing to think more critically about like who's impacted, right? And I think that what unites us on this panel is, our familial and personal experiences with this. So I am not from the state of Connecticut. I grew up in Austin, Texas, and at the time, we were the only Asian American family in like the neighborhood I grew up in. And I grew up with only one other Asian American, which was my twin brother, right? I will say that he's my twin brother. We're not identical. People always ask, are you identical? He's my twin brother. Okay. So, so coming up, I was kind of used to not being part of the majority. And, at various points in my life, there wasn't much of an Asian American community. And that's what's been so heartening about being at UConn. But I raised that kind of point about coming up is that, I had actually internalized a series of microaggressions that I took for granted. For example, go back to where you come from. I can, there are countless times when I've been told that, and it doesn't matter at what age. This is something that's consistent and not determined by a pandemic. But one incident in particular, I think, highlights the need for allyship. And I go back to that 32% of Americans who have witnessed someone of Asian descent or Asian American, where 32% of Americans, they've reported that they've witnessed this, but that's a far cry from actually reporting it to the police or reporting it as a crime, right? So I want to highlight why allyship matters, and I'm going to delve into a story that I normally share with students when I teach Asian American literature. So back in the day, prior to coming to UConn, I actually was a bartender, which was probably the coolest job I've ever had. It's the one job you can say no to people. But when I bartended in Northampton, Massachusetts, and one of the best things about that job was you got to drink for free. Okay, that is not something I want to be a takeaway from this panel, but it was a job perk. And so I went into the bar that I worked at, and I went in there, and there were 4 other people in that bar, including the bartender. They were all white. 3 of them had been at my wedding. And so we had been friends. This is kind of the culture. A person walked in and unprompted started stressing his dislike of chink food. And just, it got worse and worse and worse. And, obscenity after obscenity, talking about gooks, using pretty much every racial slur with regard to anti-Asian American racism. And he was able to drink his drink in silence with not being impacted. And he finally left, not because anybody asked him to leave, he just left. And as soon as the door closed, the people in the bar said to me, "I'm so sorry that happened." And the bartender, who was my coworker for a long time, said, "Yeah, that was really awful. That person should not have done that," right? And I found myself getting so upset. And I told a friend of mine who was not Asian American about the incident, and she said to me, "Well, you study ethnic studies. What kind of advocate are you if you can't say anything?" And and I thought a long time about that. And I thought about how much more impactful it would have been if I, as the Asian American being targeted, did not have to advocate for my own humanity in a place filled with friends and colleagues, right? It would have been much more powerful for one person to just say, hey, that's not cool, and not be a bystander or a witness. So I want to kind of like use that as like a way to highlight why allyship matters. And there have been times in my life where I have sat silent when somebody uses a racial slur against another racial group. I've sat silent and I have not said anything. And in that moment of violence, I too am culpable. So I'll just leave you with that as kind of a, you know, a discussion point.
You know, Kathy brings up a lot of points, most strikingly the statistics, and a little bit of the history of violence against Asian and Asian American communities. Something that I'm always struck when people who learn about it say, I was never taught this. I was never taught this when I went to school, when I went to high school, or even in college. And that's why, if I could put in this shameless plug at this point, why ethnic courses on college campuses are really, really important. And we have some wonderful courses that are taught here at UConn. The other bit about the statistics is that we know that the reports towards Asian and Asian Americans, particularly during that time, are really underreported. And we know this, and everybody who works in this, all of the different nonprofits and the organizations in the DC area know that even though the numbers have exploded over the last month and a half or 2 months, we know that it's still underreported because of people's fear. And so keep in mind what Kathy is saying, that I think it's important that we understand what true bystander intervention would mean, what true allyship would mean, and hopefully tonight we can come up with some strategies on how to help people do that, people who really want to do it and want to do it effectively. So thank you very much for those comments, Kathy. I'd like to turn this this conversation over to Jason Chang, who is Associate Professor in History and the Director of Asian and Asian American Studies at UConn. And Jason will share more insight on the Asian American response to incidences and the connectivity that response has to other targeted racial and ethnic groups in history. One example being the response of the Islamic community after 9/11 attacks. Jason.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see faces. And this really just grateful to be in this crowd and with these voices. So my role here, I think, is to put a little bit of context around this wonderful campaign, and to kind of think of it as a reflection of a long history of Asian American activism. And what I would maybe argue is that what Mike and Kelly are working on is an American tradition, and that this is an evolution of Asian American political activism that might be useful to kind of delve into this history of responses, because there are massive sea changes in the ways that Asian Americans have responded to racism, and so that might be a useful way to kind of frame the work that Mike and Kelly are doing. So one thing to keep in mind is that mass politics among Asian Americans did not really materialize until the 1960s. But different Asian American ethnic groups have made their mark. Chinese American responses to the Exclusion Acts in the 19th century highlight the role of courts and legal contexts in fighting for human and civil rights. The landmark case, for example, of Wong Kim Ark in 1898 was a court battle over birthright citizenship. And when he won the right to citizenship for people born in the US territory, it changed the rules for everyone. And this was a kind of unlikely, person to be, a civil rights sort of hero. But nevertheless, when when people stand up for their rights and struggle for those, it's possible that it can interlink with other people. And so there's a really interesting early example, and the ways that Asian Americans depended upon the courts for political activism because of of being denied rights of naturalization, right? So being small in number and demographically being a minority, the courts were an important point for them to take their issues to. And as Asian Americans expanded to other countries, as Asian immigration expanded to other countries, the ethnicities and politics of those immigrants also changed. So like in the 1920s, when the height of the eugenics period was in full force, there was we had the continuation of Jim Crow segregation, and other Asian immigrants besides Chinese were interpreting their political opportunities in this kind of legal climate. And it's in this context that Asian immigrants frequently fought to be considered white rather than dismantling racism. And one could, if you could think of the kinds of possibilities available to someone, they're arguing to not be discriminated against is challenging in a white supremacist context, right? So, but we have these two famous court cases, Takaozawa 1923 and U.S. versus Bhagat-Singh Thin 1924. And in these cases, we have Asian Americans who are arguing for naturalization rights. And in Ozawa's case, the Supreme Court basically said you cannot assimilate. Assimilation does not matter. You cannot earn belonging in the United States, and that Asians were aliens ineligible for citizenship. And under Bhagat-Singh Thin's case, he argued in the courts that he came from the Caucasus regions and was therefore Caucasian. But the Supreme Court responded that it doesn't really matter where you're from, but if you're not recognized as white on the streets of America, you're not white. And so these cases mark the anchors of Asian American legal political action in the early 20th century. But our national politics change, and Asian Americans were engaged in other political struggles outside of the courts. And those struggles link them to their homelands and highlight some ways that Asian American communities have been involved in international political movements for human rights, decolonization, and anti-war. Just a couple examples are Korean immigrants who fought against Japanese imperialism, Filipinos who similarly were struggling against US imperialism and occupation of their archipelago, and Sikh Americans who were also organized against British colonization back home. And what all of these have in common is the emphasis on independence, dignity, and democracy. And so when we think about some of the other ways that this is expressed, these ideas are expressed, we can point to other ways that Asian Americans found allies among other people of color. So in these same periods, Mexicans were coordinating with Japanese workers in agricultural fields in California. Sikh and Mexican families were being formed as they subverted racial exclusions to owning property, and a number of other kinds of opportunities for that Asian immigrants found because of being at the bottom of the ladder. And so when we see these kinds of political behaviors, right, we see that that there's a couple different, there's basically like two ways that that political possibilities are imagined. On the one hand, Asian Americans frequently kind of imagine that assimilation will purchase their belonging, and that goes along with not complaining, right? And then there's another route that says, well, that belonging is a human right, and that this is something that all people are struggling for, and that is an American kind of struggle. So just to give another example of, when Asian Americans have taken that route, it's been interpreted as unpatriotic and un-American. And so the choices presented are to assimilate and stay silent, or to raise your voice but be considered un-American, right? So an example of that is in 1920s, President Warren Harding visited Hawaii during a Japanese sugarcane worker strike. And while there, he gave a speech about what it means to be American. And he said, the important thing to do in Hawaii is to safeguard America first, to stabilize America first, to prosper America first, to think of America first, to exalt America first, to live for and revere America first. Sugarcane workers fighting for wage increases were later characterized as a Japanese conspiracy to undermine the Hawaii economy. So in this case, we can see it's easy to see this pattern of impossibility for Asian Americans, and that their activism has been organized around this. But these experiences show us that Asian Americans can't earn belonging, right? That because the basis of exclusion is on white supremacy, it's not on contributions. Whites weren't citizens because they earned it. They assigned themselves the status of natural born Americans with impunity. Asian Americans express a broad range of political expressions on this issue. But more recently, we can see that Asian American activism is focused on nonviolence, anti-war activism, and other coalitions. So for instance, the formation of Asian American studies is linked to that of African American studies, Mexican American, Native American studies. The exoneration of Vincent Chin's murderers in 1986, I think is when the appeal was, galvanized an Asian American community around his death, and the inability of the court system to punish those people. And lastly, we can point to some of these other more recent cases, such as the Arab and Muslim persecution after 9/11, protests against drone strikes, coalitions with Palestine, protesting more recently the Muslim ban, and also Japanese Americans who protest the immigrant detention and family separation policies of the United States now. And so it's in this moment that we're facing this resurgence of anti-Asian speech and violence. And this racist discourse is layered with international antagonisms, pandemic fears, xenophobic nationalism, economic depression, and a growing white supremacy. The inevitable outcome of this scapegoating and racist frame of understanding the COVID pandemic is harassment, attack, and persecution. And so this is why Mike and Kelly's campaign is important, because it zeroes in on personal impact that a broader racial climate creates, just as Kathy has mentioned. The way that they have mobilized this campaign around the I am not statement, the I am not this, but I am all these other things, is compelling and a positive image. It has a long history in struggles to overcome racism in the country, from as far back as the abolitionist slogan in the early 19th century, I am a man. The I am phrase has been an American declaration of human rights and democracy for those pushed to the margins of the nation. Sojourner Truth also adapted it to say, ain't I a woman, in her famous editorial. And so we see this again in the No Human is Illegal campaign in 1990s, and then again in 2001 at the I Am Not a Terrorist campaign that was also reignited after the Paris attacks in 2015. So it's the I Am Not a Virus campaign, which underscores the ways that the personal is political and affirms that Asian Americans have answers. And the campaign beautifully shows that Asian Americans get to define ourselves, and that this population, and that we will not be cast simply, but in a myriad number of ways.
I think we have about 5 minutes. I know that some of the attendees had submitted questions, and as I went over them, what was interesting is many of the questions actually were answered by the comments that Mike, Kathy, and Jason have already provided. But I think there are a couple of unanswered questions, and I'm going to bundle them together. And it really is about specific strategies of how can people be allies. You know, Kathy talked about we need to be allies, but people are really asking, help us figure out what specific strategies that could be. And so if Mike or Kelly or Kathy or Jason have anything specific that they would like to offer up, you know, we have about 5 minutes to discuss that. You know, people really want to know how can we come together to help what's going on, particularly to the Asian and Asian American community.
Hello. So one of the stories that we heard from the campaign early on was a firefighter and EMT that was in a grocery store, and she was wearing a shirt that identified her as an EMT. She's a Korean American adoptee, and a gentleman followed her for 20 minutes, and this was before mask wear thing. This was before shelter in place, and it happened in Middletown. He followed her for about 20 minutes and just yelling at her, top of his voice, for bringing the virus over, for infecting people as a first responder. And, you know, she felt really alone at the time. There's things where you could distract people when you could say, hey, this is not okay. You could ask the person, how are you feeling? Or is this is wrong? You know, stuff like that. And it happens all over in spaces like West Hartford. You know, we heard stories from Windsor. We hear stories from California, from Brazil. And it all mirrors the same. I think that feeling less alone, it's really, really helpful. You know, there's power in that. And yeah.
I think going off what Mike is saying, with our hashtag I Am an Ally initiative, which we will be releasing in June with the UConn School of Social Work, I think really becoming active bystanders is also very important as well. If you see something going on, you need to say something. I mean, obviously make sure that you are in a safe place first, but even, you know, checking in on someone afterwards is very important. Being like, hey, are you okay? How can I help you? What resources can I give you right now? And just going from there. Also being active allies, speaking up, really defending people when you can is really effective and really shows that community is just very important nowadays.
There was a question about how, which is coupled with the question I just asked, what are the next steps to address anti-Asian discrimination, especially the adverse impact on Chinese restaurants, which is very real. Many of my students whose family own Chinese restaurants, some have remained open for takeout, some have decided that it was not safe enough for them to remain open, and have really sequestered themselves in their homes because they didn't want to run the risk of being discriminated when they went out in their towns. And so, you know, my answer to that is for those owners of Chinese restaurants, but even nail salons, because we know many nail salons are owned by Korean and Vietnamese immigrants. When those start to open up, I think we need to figure out ways that we can continue to support our local business owners. We have many Asian grocery store owners. We know our gas stations are owned by many South Asians. We need, even though we may not be traveling a lot in our cars, eventually they'll need gas, and we need to support them as well. And so I think if you can support them, if you've already supported them, continue to support them. Encourage your neighbors to do that. That's their livelihood. They also have to pay bills and mortgage payments and put food on their table to feed their families. So the same issues that you're having about yourself, it's all about putting yourself in other people's shoes and be empathetic and kind. And I think this is a really important time for us to do that. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that. Jason?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I mean, I really just want to echo what Mike and Kelly have said. But I also want to encourage people to think of this not in its immediate kind of sense of urgency right now. I mean, we do need to act, but we should not just limit our actions to what we can do to help people right now. What I would really love to see is the way that concern for this moment right now catalyzes people to think about long-term change, big changes, changes in, and we shouldn't just limit ourselves to, imagining a more robust, say, public school curriculum, which is absolutely necessary, but that there's important policies that we can advocate for at the state level, at local levels, and people need to hear about that in the same way, that this is a decentralized kind of attack, and that is about a pervasive racist climate. And if this is something that is of concern to you, I hope it ignites a long concern that can inspire you to think of other kinds of commitments, and getting engaged in a political process. And I think those are some ways that we can kind of think through what the limitations are during this pandemic. I'm sorry, there's a baby Wookiee that's coming in. Hey, Omi, sorry.
I feel bad because nobody will actually concentrate on anything I say, rightfully so, because there is a Wookiee. But in the chat, somebody asked the question, well, what if law enforcement really is not, listening to that, or, kind of legitimizing it through like a complaint process? I do think that a multi-pronged approach is integral. And I don't want to steal Angela's thunder here, but it was precisely the lack of a response from law enforcement in 1987 when Asian American students were targeted and racially en route to a dance that actually prompted protests, prompted letters, and prompted the administration to create an Asian American Cultural Center and an Asian American Studies Institute. I think that one of the things that folks can do more locally, is to actually keep an eye out on news that is going to impact the UConn student community. Most recently, the Trump administration has stated that visas for Chinese students may actually be denied on the assumption that these individuals are connected to the Chinese military. And this is not something that's new. This is something that's perpetually enacted. The fact that the UConn president would not necessarily make a statement against this is quite striking. And I think that it's one thing for Asian Americans to email, but it's another thing for Asian American faculty and staff and students who are presently at UConn to do this work. It's another thing for alumni to do this work, because I would say that alumni have a very powerful voice. The letter with regard to, from the cultural centers and the institutes was so profound because there had up to that point been no formal response from the UConn administration, despite the rise of incidents on campus. So I do think that there is a way in which just an email to your home institution matters greatly because people's lives are impacted here.
Thank you, Kathy. I think we have run out of time to answer these questions, and I see there are a lot of good questions in the chat. Thanks, Jen, who hopefully one of us can get back to you, because I know that Jason started talking about that, and maybe we can answer that even more thoroughly. Yukio talked about Asian Americans advancing justice, which it really does have a wonderful bystander intervention training. So if you folks want to look at that, I would highly encourage you to do that. And then Julia Wang also talked about immigranthistory.org, and look at that. So there's lots of conversation in the chat if you want to look at that. But at this point, I know that we want to go into breakout rooms, and we want to have discussion among ourselves. So at this point, I want to thank all of the panelists for being here tonight. I think that we probably could have spent a lot more time talking about this. And this isn't the end of this conversation. I know that the Cultural Center and the Institute, going into the summer and into the fall, will be having conversations, community chats to check in with the community, or just the Asian American community and the larger community as a whole, to see where we are, where we're going, and how we can work with everybody as we try and get back to some kind of normalcy, and I'm not quite sure what that is anymore. But I just want to say to all of you who joined us tonight to please continue to be safe and healthy. And at this point, I'll turn it back to Alyssa.
Hi, everyone. So it's Abigail Jackson. Thank you, Angela, so much for facilitating such a dynamic conversation. And thank you to all the panelists and all of you who are a part of this conversation tonight. We knew that it would be hard to cover all the angles of this conversation in such a short amount of time. So we appreciate your patience, and we just will share the additional resources that have been mentioned today and a follow-up email, which will also have the recording of the discussion, so you all can continue to have these conversations in a thoughtful way around social justice and focused conversations for the UConn community.